Alrighty, so welcome to the world of glazes. Today I'm going to teach you guys about the general process of how to glaze a project. So your first step is to get your project that you're going to glaze. This is just a small thing that I'm going to work on today. It's just a test tile, we call it, but just for a demo, it'll work totally fine. So when are you ready to glaze a project? You're ready to glaze a project once it has been through the kiln one time. So this used to be standard clay, but after it was fired through the kiln, now it is what we call bisque. So it's bright white, it goes ding when you tap it, and it is now ready for glaze. You cannot glaze a project until it has gone through the kiln one time. So I've got my project. Your first step is you're going to rinse it off with water. The reason is sometimes your projects might have some light oils from your hands, they might have dust, stuff like that. Those kinds of things can interfere with the glaze's ability to adhere to your project. In other words, if you do not rinse your bisque project under running water for a few seconds, it is possible that once the glaze comes out of the kiln, it will start popping off your project and you'll have bald spots. So I'm going to rinse the project under some running water for a little while. This is going to serve two purposes. As mentioned, running it underwater helps rinse off any dust or debris that could interfere with the glaze sticking to the project. Two, running it underwater also quenches the clay's thirst. So clay is really porous, especially this bisque clay that has already gone through the kiln. So by running the bisque underwater, it helps make it so that the clay doesn't soak up the glaze quite as quickly. Okay, now I'm going to get all of my materials out. One is the bisque piece that I've soaked in water. Two is the palette that I'll be using to pour my glaze in and then paint from my table area. Three, you'll need one or more paintbrushes. Use the more fine-tipped paintbrushes for more detailed areas and use larger paintbrushes for wider areas. Three, you may consider getting a small bowl of water for your group's table and some paper towels. The purpose of this is if you're using multiple colors in one sitting, you might find it beneficial to every once in a while rinse out your paintbrush and dry it off a little before going into a different color. And then of course the last thing you'll need is your glazes themselves. So what you'll do is you'll be taking your palette and you'll bring it over to the glaze table where you can pick out some glaze colors. We're just going to show you an example with one color here today, and that color is Irish Luck. The color for each bottle is listed right here on it. Now I'm going to pour some into my palette. You'll notice I didn't pour much. Just because you have an entire cup on your palette that you can fill doesn't mean you should. These glazes can get really expensive, up to $20 for the single bottle of it. And you can imagine that all adds up really quickly. If we end up pouring too much glaze in here, and at the end of the class we have a bunch left over, we end up likely just rinsing it down the sink, which is not ideal. If you have a bunch left over at the end of class, it's great if you can somehow find a way to get it back in the bottle. Otherwise, it's wasted. So only pour as much as you think you'll need. Better yet, pour less than you think you'll need. If you need more, you can always go back for more. But if you pour too much, it ends up being really wasteful. And once we're out of these colors, we are likely going to be out of these colors for the rest of the year. So please be mindful of how much glaze you use. So I've now poured a little bit of Irish Luck glaze because I definitely won't be needing much today. What's also helpful is, as you can see, the color of Irish Luck looks to be green, and that is accurate. That's not always the case, but starting out in ceramics, yes, that is accurate. However, as we know, when glazes get fired in the kiln, their colors can change a little bit. What we have is on the whiteboard, we have test tiles that can show you what that color will look like once it comes out of the kiln. you'll see Irish Luck looks very, very similar, maybe a little bit brighter, but this is how Irish Luck will look once it is fully out of the kiln to give you a good view of what's to come. Next, I'm going to paint my bisque with the glaze. So you take your paintbrush, dip it in, and then you're just going to start laying on a coat of glaze. When you lay it on, you want to have it be a relatively thick coat. We aren't trying to do a dry brush technique. You can see that now it's starting to get dry. So at this point, I'll go into my palette, get some more Irish Luck glaze, and continue glazing it. Again, the coats are moderately thick, and I'm trying to make them nice and even. When I notice that it's getting to be a dry brush, I grab some more and paint it on. It's also important to notice that these glazes dry moderately quickly. Again, when we rinsed our bisque project under the sink, it helped slow down how quickly the bisque would soak in glaze, but it still soaks it in and dries it pretty quickly. You can see because over here on the left, it's still shiny and kind of dark in color. Over here on the right, where I started, it's getting lighter in color and it is no longer shiny. That means it is drying. It'll have a slightly chalky feel. That's important to know because we're going to be doing 3 coats of glaze on here. If you do a coat on top of another coat while it's still wet, it won't really count as a second coat. You're just mixing it in with the first coat. So once it is all dry, when it no longer looks shiny and it starts getting light, you can then begin doing your second coat. I was doing this coat mostly up and down, so the next coat, I think I'm going to do side to side. Since my project's easy to carry, I'm just going to turn it to the side. That way I can continue painting up and down. So you guys kind of get the idea of painting these coats on. Again, don't let them be too thin. There's a reason that we generally do 3 moderately thick coats of glaze. It seems pretty opaque right now, right? Like you can't really see through the glaze right now, but when it goes through the kiln, sometimes you're in for a surprise. If it goes through the kiln and you did not put enough glazes, sometimes it's going to come out very thin looking. While this one dries, I'm going to show you some different types of glaze. So as mentioned, if you don't put enough coats, it can come out in the end kind of brush strokey. This is a great example of a project that did not have enough coats. Although this beautiful light blue glaze is meant to be a rough glaze, what we call a matte glaze, there's clearly not enough coats. You can see that some areas are really transparent while others are more bold. That's because there was maybe only 1 coat of glaze right here, while there was a big gloppy area right here. This is because there was not enough even coats all throughout. You can see a similar effect in some of the red areas where it's really bold in some areas and awkwardly transparent in others. So this is not a good example of a good glazing job. It's also not very neat and tidy. This, however, is a great example of a nice glaze job. Black specifically is a color of glaze that is really hard to work with because if you ever accidentally go over the lines with black glaze, it's really hard to get it out. Generally, if you accidentally go over the lines with black glaze, you're going to see a black mark there when it comes out of the kiln. The student did a great job keeping it super neat and tidy, and you can tell that they did a solid 3 coats of glaze because everything is very opaque and not brush strokey. Very well done glaze job. Another thing that you'll notice on all of these projects is there's never glaze on the bottom of the project, and that's for a reason. We never want to put glaze on the bottom because, as you know, after we paint or glaze our projects, we put them into the kiln. In the kiln, they're going to cook to around 1800 degrees, and these glazes, they're not necessarily going to melt to the point where they're dripping down, but they are going to get kind of gooey. So if we have a gooey, sticky glaze on the bottom of this cup, and it's in the kiln on a shelf, that gooey, sticky glaze is going to glue this project down onto the shelf. You will end up losing your project because it'll be stuck to a shelf, and I'll lose a shelf because it's stuck to your project. So, moral of the story, make sure you never glaze the bottom of your projects. I'm going to show you in a moment what we do at the end of every project to make sure we are good to go. Now I'm going to finish up by doing my last coat on this project with glaze. You'll notice as you get further in with your coats, they do take a little longer to dry, and that's totally fine and totally normal. Okay, great. 3 nice and even coats on my project. So now I mentioned that you never want to have glaze on the bottom, right? There is clearly no glaze on the bottom of this piece, but let's just, for argument's sake, pretend that I did accidentally get some glaze kind of on the bottom, which happens, right? Sometimes you will accidentally get glaze down there. What's nice is that glaze, before it ever goes into the kiln, can completely disintegrate with water. So what you're going to do is you're going to go over to the sink area when you're done glazing every project. You're going to get a sponge. They're located near the sinks. Get it damp. And then you'll simply just wipe off the back side of your project with that damp sponge. Notice how all the glaze is completely coming off. That way it is safe to go in the kiln. If you do have excess glaze in your palette at the end of the class, we really appreciate if you can find a way to scoop it back into the glaze bottles. It doesn't seem like much, I know, but this stuff gets really expensive, and if we all pour double what we need for one day and we just throw it down the sink, then in theory, that means that we will go through double the amount of glaze that we actually use, which ends up being a huge waste of money. So any little bit that you have extra, if you can return it to the jars and then just lid them up, it'd be super appreciated. So that is how you glaze a project. Thanks for watching.